In the annals of modern American justice, few names evoke as much public fascination and revulsion as Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. His case, a dark tapestry of wealth, power, horrific abuse, left a scar on the public consciousness long before his death in a Manhattan jail cell. For years, the full story seemed just out of reach, buried under layers of sealed court documents, redacted reports, and whispered allegations. The public demanded answers, and a bipartisan consensus grew in Washington that the shadows surrounding Epstein's network needed to be illuminated by the hard light of day. This unified call for clarity culminated in a landmark piece of legislation. This movement for transparency became law in November 19, 2025. In a rare display of political unity, the U.S. House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act. The bill then moved to the U.S. Senate, where it was unanimously approved. The very next day, President Donald Trump signed the bill into law. The act was not a suggestion or a recommendation. It was a clear and unambiguous mandate. It required the United States Attorney General to release all government files related to the federal prosecution of Jeffrey Epstein to the public within a strict 30-day window. The scope of this mandate was vast and unprecedented. The law stipulated that these records, collectively known as the Epstein files, must be made available in a format that was both searchable and easily downloadable. This wasn't to be a token release of heavily censored papers. The act explicitly called for the declassification of materials wherever possible, ensuring that the public would receive the most complete picture allowable under the law. The goal was to dismantle the wall of secrecy that had protected Epstein and his associates for decades, providing a foundation of verified facts upon which a clearer understanding could be built, free from the rampant speculation that had filled the informational void for so long. The signing of the act marked the beginning of a new, complex phase in the Epstein saga. It shifted the narrative from one of hidden secrets to one of public examination. The law was a promise to the victims that their stories would not be forgotten, and a commitment to the American people that the justice system would be held accountable. It set the stage for one of the largest document releases in modern history, a deluge of information that would challenge journalists, lawmakers, and the public alike to sift through the evidence responsibly. The world was about to see what was truly inside the Epstein files, for better or for worse. The core premise of the Epstein Files Transparency Act was straightforward. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. By making these records public, lawmakers hoped to finally answer lingering questions that had fueled countless conspiracy theories and eroded public trust. Why did Epstein receive such a lenient plea deal in 2008? How extensive was his network of powerful associates? What did federal investigators truly know about the scope of his crimes? The documents were seen as the key to unlocking these truths. They could provide a factual baseline to separate credible information from unfounded hype. For the victims, the release represented a chance for a fuller public accounting, a confirmation that the scale of their abuse would no longer be a matter of speculation. These documents matter because they offer a rare, unfiltered glimpse into the mechanics of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that operated in plain sight for decades. Flight logs, internal emails, investigators' notes, witness interviews, financial records. Each page can add a crucial piece to an enormous, complicated puzzle. Understanding how Epstein cultivated relationships with influential figures in science, politics, and finance. It's essential for seeing how systems of power can be manipulated to protect predators and silence victims, and for developing safeguards to prevent such abuses from happening again. However, the path to transparency is fraught with challenges. Millions of pages, thousands of videos, hundreds of thousands of images. More importantly, these files contain intensely sensitive information. They detail horrific crimes and name individuals who were victimized as minors. Making these records public carries immense ethical weight. If not handled with extreme care, the release could re-traumatize victims by exposing identities and private suffering. The promise of accountability had to be balanced against the duty to protect the innocent. This documentary will navigate the Epstein files with factual accuracy and ethical responsibility. Law enforcement, journalists, congressional overseers. We'll examine what the documents reveal and what they do not. Our goal: a clear, hype-free understanding of what has been learned since the records opened to the world. It's a story about Jeffrey Epstein and the systems that enabled him, and the ongoing struggle for justice, transparency, and accountability. Table of Contents, Part 2, Act 1, The Release and Its Scale. The 30-Day Countdown, a digital deluge, navigating the archives. The world takes notice. Those are the chapters we'll cover. With the Epstein Files Transparency Act signed into law on November 19, 2025, a 30-day clock began ticking for the Department of Justice. The task ahead was monumental: to collate, review, and prepare millions of pages for public release. This was not a simple matter of scanning papers. It involved identifying privileged information, assessing national security concerns, and redacting victims' personal details to protect their privacy. Teams of lawyers and paralegals at the DOJ worked around the clock, grappling with a trove of records collected over years, spanning multiple jurisdictions and decades of criminal activity. The pressure on the Attorney General's office was immense, coming from all sides. Congress had passed the act with overwhelming bipartisan support and expected full and timely compliance. The public, energized by years of media coverage and online discussion, watched with intense anticipation. Victims' advocacy groups voiced urgent concerns, reminding the government of its solemn duty to prevent further harm. The challenge was to balance the legislative mandate for disclosure with the ethical imperative of protecting the innocent. Every decision about what to redact and what to release carried significant legal and moral weight, making the 30-day window feel impossibly short for such a delicate operation. As the deadline approached, the DOJ provided periodic updates, signaling the sheer scale of the material being processed. They spoke of terabytes of data, hundreds of thousands of individual files, and a dizzying array of formats. Handwritten notes to high-resolution digital videos. The logistical hurdles were significant. The department had to build a technical infrastructure capable of hosting these massive files and making them accessible to millions of people simultaneously. The system needed to be robust, secure, and, as the law required, fully searchable. Finally, in mid-December 2025, just within the legal timeframe, the Department of Justice announced it was ready. The initial release was scheduled, and the digital floodgates were about to open. The agency made it clear that this would be a phased release, with the first and largest batch of documents becoming available on the specified day, followed by subsequent additions as the review process continued. The stage was set for a moment of national reckoning. The secrets held within the government's files on Jeffrey Epstein were about to be exposed to the world, for anyone with an internet connection to see, analyze, and interpret. On the designated day, the Department of Justice fulfilled its initial obligation under the Transparency Act. The release was staggering in its size and scope, instantly one of the largest single disclosures of government records in American history. The first wave of documents was immense, but just the beginning. In a subsequent press release, the DOJ confirmed the total scale, nearly 3.5 million pages. A dedicated government portal was launched to host the material. The release included far more than text, a vast, deeply disturbing multimedia archive, more than 2,000 videos, 180,000 images, a raw, unfiltered look into the world Epstein created. The volume posed a profound challenge for journalists, for researchers, for the public. Each image and video needed careful examination for evidence, and for their potential to cause harm. Files were organized to meet the law's searchable and downloadable requirement. The DOJ created a web portal to access the files, sorted by case numbers, by evidence types, by investigation timelines. Most documents were PDFs, many processed with OCR to allow keyword searches. That feature was crucial. It let investigators and the public search names, search locations, search key terms across millions of pages, turning a data dump into a somewhat navigable archive. But navigation was more complex than keyword search. Scan quality varied. Redactions obscured critical context. Disorganization made coherent analysis difficult. It wasn't a curated database, a raw transfer of case files. Less like opening a book, more like being handed an entire warehouse. It would take news organizations, independent researchers, citizen sleuths, to begin piecing together the fragmented narratives hidden in the data. As the files went live, newsrooms and research organizations across the globe mobilized. Major outlets, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg News, they dedicated large teams of journalists to the task. The government portal was inundated, causing slowdowns and crashes. On social platforms and forums, a global community of digital investigators formed. Shared spreadsheets, Discord servers, and collaborative tools to divide the labor. These crowdsourced efforts were both a blessing and a curse. They accelerated discovery of key names and dates, but also became breeding grounds for misinformation, as users without journalistic training sometimes jumped to conclusions or misinterpreted complex legal documents. The release of the Epstein files was not just a national news story, it was an international event. Given the global nature of Epstein's network, foreign governments and media outlets watched the disclosures with keen interest. The fallout quickly crossed borders. One of the first and most significant international consequences came from Slovakia. Following the release, media reports highlighted interactions between Jeffrey Epstein and Miroslav Lajčák, a high-ranking national security advisor and former president of the United Nations General Assembly. While Lajčák maintained that his contact with Epstein was purely professional and social, the revelations fueled intense media scrutiny and public pressure. Facing a growing political firestorm, Lajčák resigned from his post on January 31, 2026, a decision accepted by the Slovakian Prime Minister, marking the first major political casualty of the file release. The Lajčák resignation was a powerful demonstration of the file's real-world impact. It underscored the reputational risk associated with the Epstein network. The Epstein files had effectively become a global accountability ledger, forcing a worldwide reckoning with a dark network of influence and abuse that had been allowed to fester in the shadows for far too long. The full scale of its international reach was only beginning to be understood. Amidst the torrent of data unleashed by the Transparency Act, the Department of Justice issued its own summary memorandum in July 2025, a document intended to provide an official interpretation of the evidence. This memo addressed some of the most persistent and explosive rumors. Chief among them was the concept of a client list. The DOJ's conclusion was direct and unequivocal. After an exhaustive review of all recovered materials, investigators found no such list existed. The memo explained the basis for this conclusion by detailing the nature of the evidence they did find. Investigators recovered numerous address books, contact lists, and flight manifests, both in digital and physical formats. These documents were filled with the names of thousands of individuals, from world leaders and business moguls to pilots and household staff. However, the DOJ clarified that these lists were not evidence of criminality. They were records of Epstein's vast social and professional network, not a ledger of co-conspirators. The department argued that without additional corroborating evidence, simply appearing in a contact book could not be interpreted as involvement in illegal activities, a distinction critical for legal and ethical reasons. Another central pillar of the public narrative surrounding Jeffrey Epstein was the idea that he was not just a sex trafficker, but a master blackmailer. The Department of Justice's July 2025 memo directly addressed this widespread theory, stating that investigators had found no credible evidence to support the claim that Epstein was systematically blackmailing his prominent associates. They had analyzed the thousands of videos and images, scoured his communications for any hint of extortion, and reviewed financial records for unexplained payments. Despite this extensive search, the memo reported that they found nothing to substantiate the theory. The recovered videos did not appear to be organized into a blackmail library, and no communications contained explicit or implicit threats. According to the official report, the evidence pointed toward Epstein using his wealth and connections to facilitate abuse, not to run a parallel blackmail operation. It suggested his associates were drawn to him for other reasons: access, lifestyle, or shared interests, not because they were being coerced. Beyond the questions of Epstein's criminal network, the circumstances of his death in August 2019 had been a subject of intense public debate and speculation. The official cause of death was ruled a suicide. The July 2025 DOJ memo sought to put these theories to rest once and for all. The report forcefully reaffirmed the original finding: Jeffrey Epstein's death was a suicide. However, a combination of procedural failures at the jail, guards falling asleep, falsifying records, fueled persistent theories of foul play. The memo concluded that despite the serious irregularities at the correctional facility, there was no evidence to suggest criminal intent or the involvement of any other individuals in his death. It drew a firm line between institutional negligence and a criminal conspiracy. This official reaffirmation did little to quell the skepticism of those convinced of a cover-up. The conclusion struck many as too convenient to be true. While the Department of Justice presented its findings as the definitive summary, members of Congress offered a starkly different perspective. Under the law's provisions, certain lawmakers were granted access to review the files in their original, unredacted form.
After her review session, she told reporters, "Now I see what the big deal is, and the members of Congress that have been pushing this were not wrong." Representative Jamie Raskin openly accused the Department of Justice of engaging in a cover-up. Raskin also made a stunning claim regarding former President Trump's presence in the files, stating that his name appeared more than 1,000,000 times. These congressional counterpoints created a deep schism in the public narrative.
On one side was the DOJ, with its official, legally cautious interpretation. On the other were elected representatives who, after seeing the raw intelligence, believed the public was being misled. The opposing views left the public to wonder which version of the truth was more accurate and what truly remained hidden in the unredacted portions of the Epstein files. While the Department of Justice's release was a landmark event, it was not the only source of new information. The government's files represented only what federal investigators had collected. They were a curated, if massive, slice of a much larger pie. This left open the possibility that other records existed outside the government's possession. The quest for a complete picture extended beyond the official DOJ portal and into the world of independent investigative journalism. To truly understand the full scope of Epstein's operations, it was necessary to seek out parallel sources of information. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. It was a digital treasure trove, a massive collection of private communications that had remained hidden from investigators for years. In September 2025, Bloomberg announced a major journalistic scoop. The news organization revealed it had independently obtained a massive cache of approximately 18,700 emails from one of Jeffrey Epstein's personal Yahoo accounts. The email address, jeeproject@yahoo.com, was one he used extensively for years. The trove spanned a critical two-decade period from 2002 through 2022. Recognizing the explosive nature of the material, Bloomberg took extraordinary steps to authenticate the email cache. The outlet employed a rigorous, multi-pronged verification process. They conducted cryptographic verification. Beyond the technical analysis, Bloomberg's team performed deep metadata analysis. Finally, the team engaged in old-fashioned shoe leather reporting to corroborate the contents of the emails with external sources. This combination of cutting-edge digital forensics and traditional journalistic verification allowed Bloomberg to state with a high degree of certainty that the email cache was genuine, setting the stage for a series of revelations. The verified Bloomberg email cache provided a wealth of new information, revealing communications with high-profile individuals that were deeper, more recent, or absent from government files. The correspondence detailed interactions from the highest echelons of technology, finance, and politics. Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Howard Lutnick, Kathy Remler. The communications varied widely in nature and substance. Some were logistical, scheduling meetings, travel arrangements. Others were substantive, financial matters, scientific projects, philanthropic ideas. The emails show Epstein working to remain relevant, positioning himself as a connector and intellectual organizer, arranging introductions, proposing collaborations, maintaining a busy social calendar with top figures. It's important to understand what these emails can and cannot prove. As NPR and other outlets noted, the mere mention of a name or a conversation is not proof of wrongdoing. The emails do not contain confessions or explicit illegal activity. Their significance is what they reveal about the circles Epstein moved in and the willingness of powerful people to engage. The new leads created a roadmap for further investigation. For journalists, each thread was a potential story. The release of the Bloomberg email cache thrust newsrooms into an ethical dilemma. The core challenge was how to report the newsworthy findings without acting as a reckless amplifier of gossip or causing undue harm. This required strict ethical guidelines. Responsible outlets made a crucial distinction between public figures and private citizens. Those names were carefully redacted. Journalists had to be extremely careful about providing context. That produced a more nuanced and fair portrayal. This commitment to context helped avoid misinterpretation and hype. Table of Contents. Part 5, Act 4, Redactions, Privacy Failures, Victim Harm. About 4 sections. Section 1. The Promise of Protection. When the Epstein Files Transparency Act was passed, it came with an implicit, solemn promise. While the law mandated the release of millions of documents, it was understood that this transparency would not come at the expense of the victim's safety and privacy. The Department of Justice was entrusted with the monumental task of redacting sensitive information. This was not just a procedural step, it was a profound ethical obligation. The goal was to hold perpetrators and their enablers accountable without re-traumatizing the very people the justice system was meant to protect. The logistical challenge of this task was immense. The DOJ had to review nearly 3.5 million pages. They used a combination of automated software and human review. The process was intended to be meticulous. However, the sheer scale and complexity of the release created a high-risk environment. The pressure to meet the 30-day deadline meant that the potential for error was significant. The promise of protection was fragile. As the documents went live, it quickly became apparent that this promise had been broken. Section 2. A cascade of failures. The New York Times was among the first to identify. The DOJ had published dozens of unredacted images showing young women or possibly teenagers with their faces visible. The New York Times notified the Department of Justice, and a frantic effort began within the government to contain the damage. The identified images were hastily removed from the public portal, but the digital reality meant the harm was already done. The files had been downloaded by organizations around the world. The unredacted images were already circulating on the darker corners of the internet. The failure was irreversible. The problem was not limited to images. The Wall Street Journal's review uncovered a devastating failure in text documents. Full, unredacted names of at least 43 victims were exposed. More than 24 of those named were minors at the time of the abuse. This cascade pointed to a systemic breakdown in DOJ's review and redaction process. Automated tools and human oversight both failed to catch the most sensitive information. The result was the same: a catastrophic privacy failure that betrayed victims' trust. Section 3. The human cost of an error. For the survivors whose identities were revealed, the failure was a waking nightmare. Many had spent years rebuilding their lives. They had made the difficult choice to trust the justice system. The DOJ's error shattered that trust. It yanked them back into a public narrative they tried to escape. The consequences were swift and brutal. Survivors reported being targeted by online harassment, were contacted by strangers, and were hounded by media outlets. Their personal and professional lives were thrown into turmoil. Some had never disclosed to families. Some had never disclosed to friends. Some had never disclosed to employers. Civil rights groups and victim advocates responded with outrage. They condemned the Department of Justice for gross negligence. The agency issued a formal apology and immediately initiated a full-scale review. The incident sparked a much broader and urgently needed ethical reckoning. It forced a critical conversation about the responsibilities that come with transparency. They argued for a more curated and careful approach where information is released in stages. The Epstein files became a cautionary tale. This failure prompted calls for legislative reform. The goal was to create a new framework that could better balance the competing interests of public accountability and individual privacy. Ultimately, the redaction failures served as a painful but vital lesson. The ethical obligation to protect the vulnerable cannot be sacrificed for the sake of expediency or public demand. Acknowledging that some information, especially the pain of a survivor, should never become a public spectacle. Section 1. A legacy of verified facts. The release of the Epstein files has fundamentally reshaped our understanding of Jeffrey Epstein's criminal enterprise. It has moved the conversation from rampant speculation to a more solid ground of verified, if complex, facts. We now have a clearer picture of the sheer scale and duration of his network. The documents confirm the extensive travel, the vast web of contacts spanning global industries, and the meticulous records he kept. They provide irrefutable evidence of a sophisticated operation that mingled with the world's most powerful people while preying on the most vulnerable. However, the files have also established crucial limitations. The Department of Justice's exhaustive review concluded that no singular client list exists within the evidence. Similarly, the long-held theory that Epstein maintained his power primarily through a systematic blackmail operation was not substantiated. It paints a more nuanced and disturbing picture of complicity rooted in shared interests, willful blindness, and the corrupting allure of access and influence. Ultimately, the legacy of the Epstein files is dual-sided. They stand as a monumental achievement in government transparency. At the same time, they are a testament to the limits of documentary evidence. They offer clues, not conclusions. They provide a map of associations, not a definitive roster of guilt. The files have given us the raw materials of history, but the painstaking work of interpreting them continues. Section 2. The unfinished pursuit of justice. The release of the files has served as a powerful catalyst for institutional reform. The catastrophic redaction failures forced a nationwide reckoning. In its wake came urgent calls for new protocols, stronger oversight, mandatory third-party audits, and a victim's-first approach to redaction. The story of the Epstein files closes one chapter while opening another. The initial release provided a foundation of facts, but the pursuit of true justice is far from over. It continues in courtrooms where associates may yet face charges, in legislative chambers where new laws are being forged to protect the vulnerable, and in newsrooms where journalists follow leads from the digital archives. The files provided a roadmap, but the journey toward holding every responsible party accountable requires ongoing vigilance. The Epstein saga forces us to confront a fundamental tension in democracy: the balance between the public's right to know and the duty to protect the innocent from further harm. It shows transparency is not simple disclosure, but a high-stakes process with immense power. The power to illuminate, the power to hold accountable, and, if mishandled, the power to inflict profound and lasting damage. The ultimate measure will be whether we learn from both its revelations and its mistakes.